Hello. Let me get your names down. Welcome. I'm glad you could make it today. You guys are doing well on your assignments. I'm almost done with assignment 3. You're doing very well on them. All right. Any questions before we begin this next assignment? All right, so getting into this assignment, right? We have the what's kind of acknowledged as kind of a limbo stage uh, in late late spring and early summer of 1776, whereby our our actions collectively are beginning to provoke Parliament and King George III into more coercive measures, namely just sending troops against us and arresting, and then, of course, after Lexington and Concord, beginning to actually fight us, right? Um, we have developed a second continental Congress, all right? And at this time, it seems to have been kind of an evolution. That the first couple times that they considered someone took the floor of the Continental Congress with the idea of declaring independence, it was not popularly embraced, but considered to be too severe. So the Americans we were, that's not a subtle move, right? Becoming accustomed in your day-to-day lives to not only pledging allegiance, no problem. Uh, okay, no problem. I got you there. But not only pledging allegiance to the British Crown and Parliament and to Great Britain, but also to having pride, right? Because you got to remember also that when Benjamin Franklin came to Parliament, he didn't adhere to a lot of natural rights rhetoric from the French and Scottish Enlightenments when he spoke before Parliament, but instead, on a much more practical level, he spoke of our British rights, of our English rights, according to the English common law, right? And so that's something to think about. As Americans had grown accustomed to being proud that being a subject under England was to be the freest subject uh, in the world, as opposed to subjects to other crowns. That was somewhat of a paraphrase, somewhat of an attempt at a direct quote from King George III. And a lot of Americans would have agreed with him up into the spring of 1776, when you had violence in Lexington and Concord, violence in Boston, the evacuation of Gage and the British in Boston and going to Nova Scotia, but knowing they were going to come back in full force on Long Island and New York. It's as if Benjamin Franklin had stated, the die has been cast. It's too late to put the genie back in the bottle. And so at any rate, with this phenomenon, you have this in the narrative. Oftentimes it's kind of an evolution toward fully breaking apart. And then the second part of that evolution, and I wouldn't say the second, because there are many facets to this history that ought to be addressed, but a second facet to that is unification, right? Because you got to remember, Rhode Island declared independence on its own from Great Britain, just Rhode Island, right? And so John Adams and others, Richard Henry Lee, they made suggestions a couple times in the Continental Congress that perhaps the states ought to first begin declaring their independence. Well, there were no fewer than 90 declarations of independence. And as you know, there are only 13 colonies. So literally counties, cities, villages on their own independently declared independence from Great Britain in that summer of 1776. And so when there was no turning back. And so hence, right, there's evidence, and not to mention in those declarations of independence, a lot of them would write and quote enlightenment terms. They would mention, right, consent of the governed. Yes, I should be. Um, let's see here. Is that working now? Hmm. Well, let me actually share the screen with the assignment. Can you see my goofy mug now? Right. So yeah, I'm trying to do to allow you to see me as a substitute for meeting in class. That's a primary reason for this Zoom. So I'm hoping that's working now. Um, so at any rate, um, could someone let me know if you could still not see me? And I'll continue by trial and error to continue to tinker with things. All right. So at any rate, moving on with this subject, is you have this narrative oftentimes that's brought forward that this was an evolution. This was kind of a rough evolution, Americans. But the idea is right, and as stated in number one, suggested in number one, I should say, okay, because remember these are argumentative. I invite you to challenge them. Um, is that America was in a, for lack of a better, more sophisticated way of articulating it, America was in a very libertarian and enlightened mood, if you will, during the War for Independence. So, for instance, right, the libertarianism, the states did not want to have a powerful governor. Because remember, the royal governors, the Carolinas and other places, they gave ultimatums to their assemblies to bow down to the parliamentary taxation or else. And of course, the assemblies oftentimes eventually broke free from their governors and began meeting on their own, extra legally, right? And so they were not in the mood, if you will, for a chief executive. Not to mention the rhetoric that they were reading, right, and imbibing through propaganda was telling them, right, that chief executives were armed thugs, basically, in the eyes of in the writings of pamphleteers, at this time, like Thomas Paine. You also have, Scottish libertarianism telling them that that no power, especially executive power, should be vested in one single person without extreme checks and balances on that power or limitations thereon. And so Pennsylvania went without a governor. And then many of the new state constitutions that were written, you could find some very libertarian and enlightened changes, um, to a limited degree. Let me state that a limited degree in that citizenship requirements, money requirements, landowning requirements to be a citizen and to participate in government were very mildly mitigated. Not much, though. Nothing even closely approximating universal citizenship, much less universal citizenship across color lines, right? And gender lines. No way. So nothing that enlightened, right? Um, Also, systems of checks and balances. Those, to a limited degree, already existed because the assemblies had acquired a lot of powers, in contrast with their royal councils and their royal governors. And so they continued to have a system of checks and balances with a lower house and upper house. And most of them, besides Pennsylvania, actually voted for a governor, but that's just it, is no more royal handpicked governors. Those governors could not handpick their upper house. They democratized their new states in that way. They also issued written statements in the line of individual rights, what we're familiar with our Constitution, right? With the Bill of Rights. One state after another, Virginia, for instance, passed bills of rights that enumerated, specifically cited individual rights that were not to be infringed upon or curtailed, right? And they didn't have that under the British. Um, so, like I said, to a certain extent, you also had at least 4 states that abolished slavery in the height of this kind of enlightened euphoria of propaganda spreading, right? And remember that propaganda. Remember some of the stuff. Montesquieu, you had to have checks and balances. um, Locke and Rousseau, permission of the governed to be taxed, and their government are their servants, not their masters, and to be held accountable, and the right of revolution to have them removed when they're no longer protecting people's natural rights. Natural rights, we talked about freedom of expression and freedom of the press. Several states began expanding on that. I think of like Voltaire and his writings, right? Pursuit of happiness, the idea of having a public school system and allow people to cultivate and quote improve themselves, an average person, right, to rise as far and highly as his or her merit or talent and hard work can take him or her. You had some, moderate improvements there. You look at this stuff also, separation of church and state, several Enlightenment works and Scottish liberal uh, advocates like Benjamin Hoadley and Gordon and Trenchard and others, right, who wrote Cato's letters that were translated or brought over here to the colonies and printed. They were really big on a separation of church and state. So the 9 of 13 colonies had an official Anglican hierarchy, mandatory tithing, automatic political powers given to the clergy. That was taken away. Okay, so you had some enlightened, what American, historians would contend under today's culture, right, and worldview, were improvements happening during the War for Independence, in hints that America was not in the mood for anything associated with the ancien regime, the world before the French Enlightenment, the world before the French Revolution in France, for instance, particularly, where things were old school. They were considered archaic. Kings and queens had royal veto power and could or could not convene their legislators together. The upper house of the legislators had disproportionate power to veto over the commoners in the lower branch of the property elected assemblies. Nothing was allowed as far as a referendum, like an actual popular vote given to the people. Well, Massachusetts, when they wrote their new state constitution, they issued a referendum for the people of Massachusetts to decide to approve or disprove or veto or put down this new state constitution. So you do have evidence of the states democratizing, giving more power to the people, separating and checking powers a little bit more effectively and concretely, putting things, like I said, in stone with a written constitution, which was not the case under England, right? uh, Enumerating specific rights that were to be guaranteed to the people in the states. That was happening. And then also, right, their lack of cooperation with the Continental Army. You're going to actually have rebellions among the New Jersey and the Pennsylvania militias. Because remember, under the Scottish libertarian rhetoric that they were imbibing at that time through the propaganda, um, it was telling them, right, that one of the means to retain your power is through doing it at a local level. The idea was, right, is that with Scottish Enlightenment, is that power has its own self-aggrandizing force that's almost mystical. That the more you give a strong central government power, the more it's going to accrue in a negative synergistic way, right, of just adding to itself. And so, hence, if you fear and hate government as a necessary evil that needs to be kept on a short leash, and that's libertarianism, right? Then you are to keep government localized, small, with few resources, deliberately weak, deliberately accountable, deliberately localized. And the idea of it being localized, right, is for one, they're less to get out of touch with those that they're governing because they're staying locally based, right? Not to mention, people can tell them in half jokingly way, their politicians, I know where you live. I'm going to keep you accountable by living in the same general area. Um, and so they're not going to be able to get away with as much, the idea is, right? So libertarian rhetoric lent toward having a deliberately weak, decentralized government. Well, the founding fathers, who were not a microcosm, a mini example of the population, right? For instance, like of the 55 delegates later at the Constitutional Convention, the majority of them were college educated and attorneys. That was a tiny, tiny percentage of the population that could count themselves as such. But nevertheless, one of the alleged benefits of that fact was that they were well read. They had received a classical education. And in reading, right, they thought, okay, one of the best safeguards in libertarian fashion for people's liberty to be maintained is to have a confederacy. And remember with the Confederacy that roughly existed within the city-state polices, right, or polis, whatever the plural is for a polis, a city-state in ancient Greece, right? Um, when they had the different leagues, the Peloponnesian League, etc., with Athens, Sparta, etc. Um, so they looked there and looked at their history there, and they looked at Renaissance Italian city-states, Confederacy, and Denmark, Scandinavian Confederacy. So at any rate, they had done their homework and thought, you know what, they lasted relatively well. It didn't resort in tyranny, not at least for a while. So maybe we should try a confederacy. And people who had never read anything of classical or Renaissance era history, it supposedly it was already in the rhetoric and the propaganda at the time, through the Scottish Enlightenment especially, that to keep tyranny at bay, keep power localized and deliberately small with few resources and weak. So that's what one state after another did during the War for Independence. Well, by 17, um, arguably the early 1780s, really into the war, the Second Continental Congress began to morph into a confederation. And this confederation, right, the local assemblies from each of the 13 colonies would elect men to represent them in this Congress. But they made it very clear that they wanted this Congress to be deliberately weak. So, for instance, there was to be no executive power with veto power over the Congress, so that we didn't have a president during our first united government, right? Um, Anything to pass required more than a simple majority of 50% plus one. 13 states, right? It could have required just 7 states to have their representatives, a majority of their representatives from 7 of the 13 states approve of something that could become law. But no, instead, they required 9. Then they did not give coercive tax power to this Congress. So, hence, if your reps said no to a tax, then the tax wasn't collected in your region, in your state. So they could not coerce through a majority of reps, right? Um, in Congress, they could not coerce a tax on the people in the 13 states. And so what happened, supposedly, right, is that according to number one, when we had a shot at a very libertarian and relatively, I say relatively, right? Because it's compared to what we had before, not compared to today's standards. Again, because there was no citizenship for African Americans, for women, participatory power, for the poor non-landowners, and many of the states still could not practice the rights of participatory citizenship. It doesn't, and of course, most of the states begrudgingly allowed slavery to continue. So relative to before, right, you could make the argument that during this Confederation, this deliberately weak government and decentralized government, that we practiced some evolutionary change that somewhat democratized society and made it more libertarian, right? More government is to be feared, distrusted, and you're to take the fangs out of the government's mouth so it can't gobble its own people up. When we tried that, the common argument is, and number one, by the way, guys, I'm kind of bored with, I'm waiting for a brilliant counter argument to this, and maybe it's out there and I just haven't found it yet. Because I love the way that different interpretations to the same time period or event have changed generation after generation. This has stayed the same. This is the same interpretation I received in the 90s as a student, and I'm not proud of that. But I just have yet to become acquainted with something, brilliantly antithetical to it. And so, at any rate, this same thesis is that when we tried a more democratic, more libertarian government, that the people of that generation, both the politicians in the 13 states and the common people therein, they messed the experiment up. They abused their liberty. Okay? And that they fed in to the conservative warnings and fears. Okay? And what were the conservative warnings and fears? The very same founding fathers who had read their classical works, right, did read that an end came to each of those confederations. And they found that there were certain frailties, poor decisions, mistakes, if you will, that may have been instrumental in the demise of those confederacies. And then also having a system of government that is more democratic than it was before. When you look at democracy, right? In Athens, for instance, under who I believe it was Pericles. When you look at democratic movements, they historically have thrived and then imploded from within, arguably. The founding fathers reading it, right, read conservative works from people like Aristotle and Plato as to why democracy didn't work in Athens or wouldn't work in Athens. Okay? And what do you know? What you find is a common argument, like with Aristotle, for instance, right? Is he was elitist. He believed that people by nature could change and become more virtuous through habit, but nevertheless, most people would not practice the self-discipline to change their habits and would become a slave to their own nature. And he said that nature or God created some people with a weak mind, strong body, and poor willpower and self-control, and that those people were not intended to rule, that those people were intended to do the manual back-breaking work, and that it was for the good of society that laws restrain them and governmental leaders restrain them. Because to him, right, you had an appetite. Freud would call it your id, right? Your inhibitions put aside, your natural impulses. So it's like a walking id, or walking appetite. Christianity, right, would call this the flesh. You see something, you immediately want it. Do you just reach out and grab it like a child? I recall bringing my kid into Carmel. We went into a somewhat fancy restaurant, and he was a toddler. And I was holding his hand, thinking I had good control of the situation. And he reaches out and grabs a piece of bread from someone's table as we're walking to our table because it looked appetizing to him, to my mortification. And so he was giving in, he was succumbing to his id, right? But with Aristotle, you can cultivate, and some people are just born with a stronger reason, logic, perhaps like your internal mom and dad with Freud, right? I believe he called it the superego. Your superego is there to tell you, don't touch that bread, Dante. That doesn't belong to you. You're on your way to a table and you can get your own bread, right? And so the contention is by Aristotle is the average person is ruled more by his or her appetite than by reason and is lacking the self-control. And not to mention, he's elitist about intelligence as well. And he was elitist about education and doesn't have access to enough education to be properly trained to rule him or herself, right? And remember, as elitist as this sounds, some of our conservative founding fathers took this kind of posture and saying, okay, we still believe in the inherent political equality of all people, that all people ought to be entitled to the same rights and opportunities, same privileges, right? Same protections under the law, but that not all people are equally capable of ruling. And I liken it today by saying, okay, do you believe everyone is equally capable of writing an English paper for you or fixing your vehicle when something goes awry in your car? And of course, it's a rhetorical question. The answer is meant to be no, right? People differ in their background, their expertise, their training, and their natural skill. So at any rate, that was the argument that conservatives were embracing as they were reading, especially elitist works by people like Aristotle. Okay. So they're looking at their own generation and they're saying, guys, this is too democratic. This is too decentralized. People can't handle that much freedom. They're going to inevitably abuse it. Just read your classical Aristotle, and you should know this. All right. And so, number one contends, like I said, historiographically, this is a bit boring because this interpretation has been the predominant one for generations. But that the first generation during and just after the Revolutionary War or the War for Independence, that they abused their increased powers of participation and their increased liberty from tyrannical government. They abused that liberty, and it convinced enough of the founding fathers that the conservatives were right, that there needs to be a less democratic and more centralized and powerful government, because they were convinced that life under the Articles of Confederation had become, for lack of a less cliche adjective, chaotic. So do we have evidence for chaos during this time period? Well, for one, you see a lot of factionalism. Remember, factionalism, as popularized by James Madison, is when a group, it's like a lobbyist group that shares the same economic self-interest when they go for theirs, somewhat at the expense of what's good for the entire country and what's good for other factions. So people that share what they do for a living are a faction, right? So for instance, New England merchants, they didn't want the West to be opened to expansion because they liked the economic, financial position they were sitting in at the moment. Already by this time, you guys, and how much more by the antebellum period before the Civil War, most most loans were owed to northeastern bankers, particularly in New York. Okay, from the early beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, from the 1790s, really, just after this, um, most of the new mills or factories are going to erupt in the New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. Okay. And so most mass produced industrial goods were sold by New Englanders and bought everywhere else, particularly in the South. All right. So hence, life was good for them. They didn't want any new rivals as a new faction arising in the West would inevitably happen. So they did everything they could to keep Western commerce and Western development from happening. And remember, under the Articles of Confederation, it required 2/3, 9 of the 13 states to approve of anything. So they would abstain selfishly out of their own self-interest. Southerners tended to do the same and vote for only that which was good for the major cash crops, like tobacco and a burgeoning one that's going to take over everything in the South, arguably cotton, starting in the 1790s. So each section tended to look out for its own interest only. New York and New Jersey began commercial wars with one another or with each other. There were rivers that joined the two states, right? And so merchants would go across state lines on a regular basis. Those in New York began heavily taxing the merchants and their merchandise that came from New Jersey. New Jersey then retaliated in heavily taxing anyone and anything that came from New York. They were known as commercial wars. Land in the West that was claimed in the Ohio Valley. Maryland held on to an old charter given to Lord Baltimore. Virginia held on to its ancient charter claims, and so did New York. All three of them claimed the land was theirs. And they had heated diplomacy, and they kept anything from happening as far as that land developing. Now, I'm speaking as if development in the West was a good thing, was a necessary thing. And I don't mean to mislead you there, because after all, who is inhabiting the Northwest? West of the Appalachians and east and just west of the Mississippi River, primarily Native Americans. And obviously it was their land first. Okay. But this is how the narrative goes, was that they depict this as a bad thing, hampering future developments. By the way, that is going to be overcome, that obstacle, whereby they're going to issue the Northwest Ordinances, where they are going to claim Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, all around the Great Lakes as future states to join the Confederation, which of course they'll end up joining our republic that we have now by the time they came into being. But there is a systematic process of development that is to happen in those states. The Land Survey Office comes, they put everything into so many mile square acres. So many of the mile square acres are to constitute a city or town. Lot 16 of each city or town is to be set aside as a public school. And of course, when they get to a certain number, they began with a low number of 6,000, it went up to 30,000, etc. You get a certain number of inhabitants, you could have a general election, elect people to a state convention. They write a new state constitution. It cannot contravene the laws of the federal constitution later on. And the Congress decides to accept their state constitution or not. And they're added as a new state to the Union. So that did happen. But there were many monkey wrenches that were thrown into this imperialist agenda. One was Native American attacks. Look up a guy named Little Turtle. Look up a guy named Pontiac. They each had pretty grand rebellions that were momentarily successful and scared the heck out of the Confederacy and the early Republic. You also had land speculators from multiple states, and they were wanting a piece of the pie in the West. And they did everything they could to keep Congress being able to pass through 9-state approval, grabbing onto this land because they wanted to keep it nebulous so that they could come in and make money as private speculative companies. Remember, speculating is like flopping houses, right? You come in and purchase it as cheaply as possible, develop it, and then sell it for profit. Arthur St. Clair, the leader of the Continental Congress at one time, himself was a part of a speculating company. And so clearly you have instances of, what's the term they use? Whereby you have a private claim and interest as well as your public claim and interest as a politician. Just conflicting interest, basically, right? But there's a better claim than that, better term. That's not coming to me. So hence, politicians have conflicts of interest. They also have, they were using public funds for their own private lives. All right. Also, because the Congress, the deliberately weak Congress, was powerless to force taxes on the people, they asked each state to pay for the debts that were being incurred during the war. Because remember, the militias and the members of the Continental Army both were entitled to salaries and land promised to them for fighting in the rebellion. Well, many states and areas were unable, including the Continental Congress, to make good on those claims, to pay them for it, for their service. So hence you had mutinies in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania. So what did states begin to do? They did something that economic historians, and I defer to them because I don't have that side of the brain, but economic historians contend is very myopic. It's very narrow and short-sighted, is they simply printed money. During the War for Independence, supposedly over $200 million was printed as new money. And that was 200 million back then. All right. So each state tried to resolve it that way. And of course, that is going to result in inflation, where they print enough money that money ceases to really have any value to it. Everything becomes so high in price. Not to mention, as they print more money, right, the value of it decreases. And so then you have a conflict of interest between two different factions, the creditors or lenders and the borrowers or debtors. And it's easy to guess which faction is going to side on what side of the issue each faction is going to be on, right? If you owe money, you love the idea of printing more money and inflation, right? Because if you owe $100, $100 ceases to mean a whole lot and is more easily repaid to your lender, your creditor. If you're a creditor and $100 was $100 at the time of lending that money, you don't want an inflated $100 that with its purchasing power is now the equivalent of $25. So you're against the printing of money. So these factions are going to battle it out in each of the states. And in a couple occasions, especially one in Massachusetts, it's going to turn bloody. And it's known as, oh, don't fail me now, Daniel Shays Rebellion, which is a bit of a misnomer because a lot of the major parts of the narrative, he was not singularly in control of this rebellion. But nevertheless, it was associated with Daniel Shays' name, so known as Shays Rebellion. Debtors, on more than one occasion, used the power of the Democratic vote and pressure upon their elected reps to issue themselves stay laws that would extend the time period required for them to be able to pay their loans back. They did it on more than one occasion. Finally, the creditor factions in Boston gained enough support by convincing people that this was harmful for everybody, not just them, the creditors. So finally, the state reps said enough is enough. And they said, you must pay back your debts at this certain date or else. And remember, we were still morphing from English common law. So all the way up to the late 1800s in the Gilded Age of your History 17B, you could be fined and imprisoned for dereliction of debt payment, for failing to pay your debts. You could be put in jail. And not to mention your collateral, the wealth that you owned in property and assets could be taken from you, including, of course, your land that you're on. So I think you know where this is going. Judges from the East Coast of Massachusetts came into the western regions of poor, ambitious farmers and began calling them into trial and making final ultimatums for them to pay their debts. And what made it even more resented was also their taxes, because Massachusetts was one of the most heavily taxed, directly taxed states of the 13. So when you were unable to do so, they would confiscate your property and they'd have you arrested. So in Shays' Rebellion, they decided at the threat of force not to allow this to happen. They put on their old militia and Continental Army uniforms, came armed to the local courthouses, and threatened to kill the judges if they laid one hand on their property or their persons. Well, it's going to culminate in at least two pretty significant battles. So they're actually going to fight it out. The state militia of Massachusetts against this army of poor, indebted farmers. The poor, indebted farmers are eventually going to surrender. But to George Washington and other conservatives, this was beyond alarming. It was evidence to them that their generation did not deserve too much freedom, that they would inevitably and were inevitably abusing it, and that there needs to be a stronger central government. Okay? So hence with number one, the boringly, long-lasting thesis is that the first generation independent from England gained for itself, claimed for itself more liberties, more democratic participation, a deliberately weaker government than had previously been known in the colonies, arguably, at least collectively. and they abused it. They fought with one another. Nothing could get passed. None of the debts could get paid. None of the major objectives could be achieved. And that the very conservative fears of giving too much power and liberty to too many people was coming into fruition before that generation's very eyes. Enough so that even the libertarian founding fathers agreed that something a little bit more powerful as far as a federal government needs to be devised. So hence the demise of our first government. And as you're familiar with, the government we're under now will result for them meeting in opposition to the events that were going on and concern for the events that were going on in May of 1787 in Philadelphia. Number two, when they met in Philadelphia, right? You have limited access to minutes because the founding fathers deliberately wanted to have latitude to speak their minds without members of the press there and hash things out privately. You have just a couple exceptions of people who kept notes, and future generations have been able to acquire those notes. So we have inferences, little windows, if you will, into what happened. You definitely had a strong libertarian faction that was still alive and well at this Constitution. You had some of those members even walked out of the convention and refused to sign it, this new Constitution. You had others who tried to dissuade the majority from signing it to the very last second. And you had others, kind of like, I would say, Thomas Jefferson, who was, by the way, away in France, I think deliberately, who felt like they saw the writing on the wall. They saw that this conservative, swinging to the opposite direction of the pendulum had to happen, but they darn sure weren't happy about it and weren't going to enjoy it or even endorse it. So they kind of silently acquiesced to what was going on. So when you look at Article 1, Section 8, that article alone will convince you they are no longer under a confederacy or confederation. Now it explicitly states the federal Congress has power over the states and doing this and doing that and doing this and doing that. And of course, to directly tax them, to raise an army, have an actual standing army, to put down rebellions, to commandeer state militias and force the state militias to fight under federal command against an invasion, internal rebellion, or war. So if you wanted to take a look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, you're going to do this next, however, on the next assignment. You also originally have no Bill of Rights. So separation of church and state, freedom of expression, right to bear arms, collectively your due process rights when indicted for a crime. None of that was originally put in by the founding fathers. But what did they put in? They put in a contract clause. Contracts made before this constitutional convention are to be recognized after. So meaning if someone owes you money, he still owes you money. If you own a slave, you still own that slave, sadly, as agricultural or chattel property. Right? So it was controversial. It was conservative. You look at the preamble to the Constitution, it states 5 or 6 reasons for them putting together the Constitution. And not until virtually at the end, just one of 5 or 6 reasons, it states, and to secure our liberties. But it was mainly about for the general protection and welfare of the Republic, for our safety. A lot of the aims, in their own words, were conservative. Remember, conservatives were about power, stability, safety, general welfare. The liberals were libertarian, and the liberals were about freedom, opportunities, protections. So at any rate, after they write and they approve, right, the 55 members of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they approve it, they try to immediately go back to their old Confederation assemblies. And some were even less democratic than that. They tried to have the delegates themselves to Philadelphia ratify the Constitution. That's like grading your own paper. You're supposed to, in the name of transparency and accountability, the same faction, the same individuals that write up a constitution should not be the same ones that get to approve it. And according to Pauline Meyer's book, that's exactly what many of the founding fathers tried to do. But what happens? Here's where the romantic facet of her thesis comes in. Especially in Massachusetts, villages, towns, cities began electing their own reps, sending them to the state conventions, ratification conventions, or approval conventions, giving their convention delegates ultimatums. For instance, my town will not approve of this new republic unless you first print it and let the people read this new constitution. Some even tried to insist that there be a popular referendum and let just a direct election by all the citizens decide if they would approve or not approve of this constitution. Many of them gave specific mandates stating, we want no part of this unless something is in there securing the rights of individuals to a free press, to expression, for instance, or to a trial by jury of their peers. Something against cruel and unusual punishment. I think you know where I'm going with this. As according to her book, the Bill of Rights and other very enlightened components to our Constitution, of which we're still today very proud, were not initially intended to be given by our conservative founding fathers, but were begrudgingly conceded when the people of the several states rose up and demanded that their concerns be incorporated into this new constitution. So it's very revisionist and cynical concerning our founding fathers, portraying them in a very, arguably negative light, but very romantically, lauding, praising the people, the common people of that generation, and making demands upon their founding fathers. Some even say that with Shays' rebellion, that it remained as a quote ghost to the conservative founding fathers, knowing, right, that they had to engage and give and take with the liberals and with the common American people, citizens, or else they might have a nasty rebellion again on their hands. Okay, so are there any questions about number 1 or number 2? Or any comments? Could I get a thumbs up? Are you guys with me? All good? Good. Thank you, Yesenia. Thank you, Maria. Rose. Thank you. So I apologize, you guys, but you don't have too long to do this one. I believe the War for Independence was due tonight, right? And you just have a few days to do this next one. Or not even a few days. Let me look at my schedule and see what I can do, okay? And please remember, I'm literally like contractually, at least I believe I am, I'm contractually obligated to teach you these 13 subjects, right? It's part of the basic accepted curriculum of History 17A. And we have a very finite amount of time to get through these 13 topics, including, taking 3 tests. So please keep that in mind, okay? I'm not trying to put a heavy load on you when I give you a short time period to do an assignment. All right, so are there any general questions? Because if not, you guys, we'll go ahead and call it a day and you'll get your extra credit. Anybody have any concerns, etc.? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right, you guys have a great day, okay? And I'll see you again on Monday. All right, take care. I appreciate you.